Hi, this is a session for creative, cultural and heritage organizations looking to embark on an evaluation or a monitoring exercise. Today we're going to be talking about monitoring and evaluation skills. So if you're embarking on a process like this, then this is the session for you. I'm Vishalakshi Roy and I'm director of Earthen Lamp. We are a research-led strategic consultancy that work in the creative and cultural sector. We've been working with over 300 creative and cultural organizations delivering projects of all shapes and sizes. So today I'm hoping to share some of our skills and expertise with you as you embark on your own journey into doing evaluation and monitoring projects. So the first question then is why evaluate or monitor? And I think we need to understand the differences between the two. So monitoring is an activity, and it's the systematic collection of information from either a project or a program over a period of time. Evaluation, on the other hand, is a process. So it's not a single activity, it's a long-term thing. And it's an appraisal of information against some kind of predetermined objectives or maybe for specific outcomes. But that said, both of these processes and activities are geared towards doing fairly similar things. The outcomes that we want from it are fairly similar. We're looking to understand impact. We're maybe looking to gather knowledge and learning. We're sometimes looking to do this to take strategic decisions or maybe help with development of a function. And more often than not, we're also looking to demonstrate accountability. What is interesting, however, is that when we embark on evaluation and monitoring exercises, we tend to focus on the impact and the accountability within the creative and cultural sector. And actually, we forget about the knowledge generation and we forget about the decision-making or the development functions. So I'm hoping I'll be able to sell that to you a little bit today and kind of underline why those are important. So let's start off maybe talking a little bit about the different types of evaluation that there are. So what are the different types of evaluation and how do we make those decisions on which one we want to implement? So broadly, evaluations can be seen as either formative or summative. Simply put, formative is when you do evaluation over a long period of time and it kind of follows a process, whereas summative is primarily at the end where you're reflecting back on a project or a program that's happened. You could have a product or an outcome-based evaluation or maybe a process-based evaluation. When it's an outcome-based evaluation, you're trying to understand about an outcome. And a process-based evaluation is actually looking at the overall thing that's happened. You could also have impact assessments, and within the sector that we work, the social impact, economic impact, and indeed artistic impact are areas that are actually quite popular for evaluation projects. I think most cultural evaluation frameworks is actually a combination of all of these factors. They're not one or the other. And I think that's probably one of the best ways to proceed if you're devising your own evaluation framework. So let's start with talking about the process of evaluation. And I think the first thing we want to look at within that is the evaluation framework itself. And one of the questions that come up quite a lot, do we really need an evaluation framework? I mean, can we do this without one? I'm definitely going to advocate for it. So in one word, yes, we do. And I think the reasons for having an evaluation framework in place is because it guides the development of the overall evaluation questions. And if we've got the evaluation questions right, from that, it guides the outline of what data needs to be collected, and then from that, what tools we need for that data collection. So it is a framework that actually puts the whole activity into some kind of a strategic strategic output. Without that, we're doing a lot of sporadic activities without it all coming together. And they serve a variety of functions. I think we see a lot of evaluation frameworks which are probably focused on just providing outputs for funders. But all those other functions that we talked about at the start, which was around accountability, but also learning and development, those are all areas to bring into an evaluation framework. So a good evaluation framework actually supports a lot of regular learning and data collection within a project or a process. So I would definitely advocate for having one in place right at the start of your evaluation project. I want to share with you our way of the LAMPS process of coming up with an evaluation project. So I've got a model to show you, and within that model you'll see how we start and finish when we look at an overall evaluation project. So usually we start with clarifying the outcomes. Once we've clarified the overall outcomes of the project, we would look at harnessing the knowledge that already exists. From that comes the framework. So the framework doesn't come out of just the activity that we're looking to evaluate, but everything that's gone before as well. Once we have a framework in place, we would do a primary research, so gather data, gather information about that particular project or program that we're looking to evaluate. From that, we would make sense of the information that we've gathered, which is the analysis stage. And after the analysis comes the interpretation of the information that we've got. A lot of projects finish here, interpretation and then reporting, but at Earthen Lamp, we try to take that a bit further, and I would advocate for doing that in your own projects as well. I think it's quite important to disseminate the information that you've got to the right people so they know what was found through the process. And it's really important to do a follow-up with all the people that have accessed that information, just to embed how those different findings are being used in different activities. And actually, evaluation is a cyclical process. So, then there'll be the next program, and you can basically use all this information that you've got in your previous project to inform the objectives of the next one. So that's the model that we use, and I'm hoping that there's something in there that resonates with you that you'd be able to borrow for your own projects. Great, so moving on, we'll talk a little bit about the skills for evaluation and maybe some of the tools. And the whole purpose of having this discussion is to try and help you understand and make some choices about what kind of things might be relevant for your project or activity that you're hoping to evaluate and monitor. So one of the questions to look at then is, what kind of skills do we need to do a monitoring and evaluation project? There's a variety of skills that are needed, but I'd quite like to highlight some of the key things that I feel are worth considering or thinking through at the start rather than somewhere in the middle of your project itself. You definitely need skills around planning and development of the framework specifically. So being able to think strategically about what is it that you want to achieve, that's quite important. You need to have some skills around devising the tools, devising the data collection, or whatever the exercise would entail in terms of gathering information. So some skills involved in actually doing that whole activity. I cannot stress enough how much, and I don't know if this is a skill or a quality, but objectivity is definitely needed if you're embarking on a project. So you need to be able to think objectively about the overall exercise and not have expectations about exactly what it's going to tell you even before you started the process. So objectivity is key. And another thing that's key is actually consistency. Again, I'm not sure if this is a skill or a quality, but I think it's important enough to mention it here. Consistency is really important when you're embarking on a project like this. Other skills that I'm guessing is quite a no-brainer really, but you do need skills of being able to collate information. Whatever information you end up gathering, you do need to bring that together in some way. So you do need skills of being able to collate sometimes large amounts of data. So that's quite key. And I think one of the skills that is probably not valued as much as it should be is writing succinct and effective reports. So reporting on the information that you've gathered through a process and being able to write in a way that resonates with all the users and is able to, is useful for people. I think that's quite a key skill as well that you need if you're embarking on a project like this. And one of the other key skills is being able to look back, reflect, and learn from the process. And it might be that there's a team of people who do that, and it's not necessarily left to the key person who's actually delivered most of the project. but I think it's quite important to have somebody within your team who takes charge of that reflection and learning and embedding those learnings within your team. So those are just some of the top sort of skills that I think are quite important and something that you might want to think about before you start your project. So the other question that comes up quite a lot from our clients and people we work with, we need large numbers. Should we just do a survey? I think in some sense, if you are looking to do a project where we're looking to consult with large numbers, surveys is a great tool. But actually, that's not the only tool, and I'd quite like to talk to you about some of the tools that might exist. I think surveys do take the top position when it comes to gathering data from large numbers, and actually currently quantitative surveys that are done online are quite popular. So in-person data collection within the creative and cultural sector has been happening for as many years as I can remember. But actually online data collection is probably still going up in popularity, so I would advocate for that. But in addition to online data collection, you could also collect data using surveys face-to-face, or indeed you could do it online through a telephone call or Zoom calls and other sort of online facilities like that. So it doesn't just have to be a case of clicking and ticking boxes. There are different ways of delivering surveys. In addition, a lot of different social media channels that we use nowadays also give us the facilities to do polls. Online polls are also quite popular for gathering large numbers, quantitative data for the cultural sector. So I would say if you were to make a decision on how, what kind of survey you might use or how you might gather data, think about the skills you have in-house, think about the time and the budget you have. But I think more importantly, think about the objectives. What is it that you're trying to find out and who from? So those are the things that will help you make those decisions on what kind of survey you do and how do you roll that out. The other question we get when we talk about tools and methodology is, well, we don't need numbers. Should we just do some focus groups? Well, yes, you could, but there are other ways of collecting information that's not focus groups. And I think it's important to kind of have an idea of the different tools that are at your disposal. You could do in-depth interviews, which are more, the content might be very similar to focus groups, but they're more one-to-one, and actually that gives you more objective data. So people might tell you things that they don't want to tell you in a large group of people. Interviews can also be done as byads, where you have two people having a small discussion and talking to the researchers. So focus group entail a lot of people, but interviews could be smaller groups in which you can consult with your users or with your audiences and people that you want to include in your evaluation. In addition, you could have things like panels. Now, panels are actually, or user panels are used when you do any kind of evaluation which goes on for quite some time. So we can gather longitudinal data from it. So you can basically go back to the same set of people at different points in time, and that's how you would use a panel of users for your evaluation. In addition, we are increasingly using observational research and also mystery shopping within the creative and cultural sector. And these are all research methods that are at your disposal to use if you don't want to use surveys or if surveys aren't relevant to you. Again, I think to make these decisions, you need to think about your purpose, you need to think about your budget, and you need to think about the different stakeholders that you are consulting with as part of the process, and that's how you would make a decision on which tools you might use. Those are just some of the common questions about methods and tools, but there are lots of other questions that come up when we talk about evaluation and monitoring. I'll share with you some of the common questions that have come to us. Who should we speak to and who should we include in our evaluation project? Well, I think I would challenge you to think a bit broadly. So obviously users and visitors and audiences are usual suspects. But I think it's good to think beyond that, maybe partners, maybe people who are sort of passively experiencing your activities, maybe not actively so. And it's quite good to think about giving your project a bit more of a rounded view and including other stakeholders within it as well. How many participants is too many participants? that's quite an interesting one. And I think, of course, you can go into, if you're doing a quantitative piece of a quantitative evaluation, you can go into sort of sampling theories, look at, what is a representative sample and things like that. And there are lots of online calculators that would do that for you. But I think in some sense, how many participants also depends on the quality of participants and how much information you can get from each one. And that would dictate how many you might need to include. If you're doing something more qualitative, where you're having conversations, actually a small number of participants is probably quite good to have, but you can get a lot more depth of information from a small number. If you're doing a survey, I think, we try and ensure that we don't get any less than 100, because percentages don't make sense if you've got less than 100 responses. But, this can go upwards into thousands and sometimes hundreds of thousands as well. Another question that we've had, and I think I talked a little bit about this when we were talking about the process model of doing a project, is how do we use the information that we have already? And especially if you're evaluating a project where you have done the same project or similar things in the past, I think it's actually a really good idea to use whatever information you had from that within this evaluation. And I think the best thing to do is to build it use that information within your evaluation framework. There is nothing worse than trying to find out the same information over and over again when you know what it is from previous years. So it's important not to waste our efforts doing that. So it's really important to use that information. When should monitoring start and finish? I think with this one, monitoring itself obviously follows the same timeline as the activity that you're doing. So do try and start right at the start of the activity. And when we say monitoring, we're talking about gathering regular information. This could be numbers of people. It could be things like postcodes. It could be trying to understand the profile of the people who are accessing your activities. It could also be things like enjoyment levels. But whatever it is that you're doing over in regular intervals over a long period of time, do start at the start of the activity and wind that up at the point at which your activity finishes. The timing for when should evaluation start, and the timing for evaluation planning actually is at the same time as your project planning. I can't tell you the number of times we've encountered projects where the thought of actually starting the evaluation project was maybe midway or at the end of the project, and actually that's not a very good time to start an evaluation project. So plan your evaluation at the same time when you're planning your project. And I think that I would definitely strongly advocate for that. And the last one I'd like to talk about today is about software. The number of times you get asked about what software can be used to gather data, to analyze data, to report on it. And I think we're quite lucky now, especially over the last few years. There's a lot of free software that's available. There's a lot of software that have a very basic level of subscription, which allows you to do quite a lot of things almost automatically. You don't have to actually put in that much effort into gathering some really attractive and useful information from it. So there's quite a lot of different software. I think depending on what you're trying to do and the timelines and obviously your budget, there are different things that you can use. It's actually quite difficult to advocate for specific ones, but the ones that I would advocate for, which we use quite a lot, seems like a bit of a no-brainer. We use Excel and Word a lot more than you'd think, rather than specialist software, but there is a lot out there. So now that we've talked about the skills and tools, I think it's important to talk about some of the considerations that you need to have when you're embarking on an evaluation and monitoring project. And also, I'd like to talk to you about some of the current trends in the sector that you might be able to use in your projects. What are the legal and ethical considerations? Actually, there are a few that I think it's really important to keep in mind when you're starting a project like this. Thankfully, there aren't loads, but there are a few, and most of them are fairly common sense based. But I will also signpost you to some resources where you can get more information. The first one, obviously, is around a GDPR or General Data Protection Regulations. If you are gathering any kind of personal data within your projects, then these regulations apply to you. There are 7 principles, but broadly, They're around being lawful, being fair, and also being transparent in how you collect, how you keep, and how you dispose of your personal data. If you're doing any kind of consultations with minors, and especially if they're under the age of 16, there are specific ethical considerations that you have to keep in mind. There are published regulations around that, but this is something that you do need to bear in mind if your project or activity deals with young people. There are also some considerations regarding confidentiality, anonymity, around respecting the independence and indeed the consent of the participants. And the regulations that we tend to use is the Market Research Society Code of Conduct. Again, this is a resource that I will signpost to you, but I think that's a really good measure and a really good guide of some of the considerations in relation to the participants or the people that you're consulting with that you need to keep in mind if you're working with people in your project. The other current consideration is around how do we ensure that our evaluation processes are inclusive? How do we make sure that it is including a range of people within the activity? We all know that people aren't homogeneous and we shouldn't be treating them as such. And actually there are some really good guidelines that have been published by the Market Research Society called the Diversity and Inclusion Guidance. And I would really prompt you to have a look through that and see how you might be able to build some of that within your activity. This is around language, around tools, and how they might be interpreted or accessible to different parts of society. Also, there are some really good guidelines around making assumptions in your language and how things are framed around people's ethnicities, nationalities, gender, and so on. So again, a really useful resource for anybody doing evaluation at the current time. If you want to ensure that your evaluation processes are in line with current thinking, I think one of the really great resources to use is the evaluation principles that are being proposed by the Center for Cultural Value. This is a new set of principles that have been compiled by a range of individuals that work within research and evaluation in the creative and cultural sector. And they've proposed 4 key principles that are really worth spending some time thinking through and then applying to your project to ensure that it is in line with what is happening within the sector. Broadly, the 4 principles are that your evaluation is beneficial, robust, people-centered, and connected. And I think a lot of the things that we've talked about today all kind of converge into these 4 principles, but it's a really good resource for you to just use as a guide or a checklist when you're devising your overall project. So that brings us to the summary of the session, and I'd quite like to just reflect on some of the things that we've covered today. So we started by looking at the definition and the differences between evaluation and monitoring. We looked at the overall process, and I shared with you how we approach the process, and I'm hoping that you'd be able to come up with a process that makes sense for your project or for your organization. We also reflected a little bit on the tools and the skills that are needed to do evaluation, and I tried to share with you some of the common questions and areas of concern that we work through when we're doing in those areas when we're doing an evaluation project. We also talked a little bit about the legal and ethical considerations that are needed for devising and indeed in carrying out an evaluation project. And I tried to share with you some of the current thinking or areas that are relevant to evaluation in the creative and cultural sector. Obviously, this is just a starting point. There is loads more that we can talk about. I have, as part of this session, provided a set of resources that I'm hoping will be useful for anybody starting on an evaluation activity. However, I think the next steps are for us to have an opportunity to discuss some of the areas and questions through a webinar, which is going to be next month. However, do feel free to get in touch with us. I'm sharing my contact details with you here, so do feel free to get in touch with me or my team at Earthen Lamp if we can help you with any of your queries or even signpost you to any of the resources that might be relevant to your overall project. I hope you've enjoyed this webinar, and I look forward to meeting some of you very soon.